Well, thank you to the people of Sheffield for inviting me back. And let me pull up my screen. Hopefully, you can see this screen that says Airmail and Oceans.
Yes, no problem.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't see the screen at all because I've just got a notice saying this meeting is being recorded.
Hmm.
I think if you
click on that, James, and it'll disappear.
Yes, if you click on got it, it'll disappear.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, well, super. As Richard said, my name is David Ball. I'm the president of the American Airmail Society, and often with lectures that are given in philatelic context, there's a great deal of research and knowledge, and it's a very complex, take notes and think about it. This is not that kind of a lecture. This is kind of more like a show and tell. It's showing you pieces from my collection that and showing you what it was that I found so amazing about it. Was it all of the auxiliary markings, all of the different transit markings, the different kinds of franking, how early it was that you could imagine that something would travel by airmail across an ocean. So, like I said, if you're looking for a real deep dive and to learn a lot of meaty stuff, you won't. This is really showing a bunch of covers and kind of tracing the parallel progress of the movement of airmail with that of aviation as we cross the Atlantic and Pacific. So in the colonies, we first had airmail in 1859, and it consisted of a balloon in Indiana, which took up 146 pieces, of which the National Postal Museum has found one back in 1957, and it says that this guy is leaving from the city of Lafayette, and he expects to land in Philadelphia. And so it went in this balloon called the Jupiter. And, obviously with balloons, you're kind of at the mercy of the wind and the weather, and who knows where you're going to go, whether you're going to actually go in the direction you want to go. So obviously powered flight is something that we much prefer when dealing with the movement of mail. And even 100 years later, we still have balloon mail. So this is a piece that was carried on the Double Eagle II, leaving out of Maine and arriving in France in the late 1970s. But what I wanted to go back to is talking about the movement of mail first across the Atlantic, then the Pacific, and then finally show you some pieces that are around the world mail, because I think those are a lot of fun as well. So initially, there were three major thrusts in the post-war era, and these were kind of encouraged by the Daily Mail, which offered a 10,000-pound prize, which is a considerable amount of money, to take advantage of some of these technical advances that were seen in aviation with World War I. And so those participating in that were Hawker and Alcock, and also to a lesser extent Reed from the U.S. Navy. And you can see from this picture that Hawker gets about halfway across, and Alcock makes it all the way, and Reed, I'm not quite sure what he's doing. So when you see an envelope in this presentation that has a red box around it, it means that I don't own it. It's a picture that I took off of some website, and I would like to own it, and maybe someday I will, but not in my possession. But so now in this case, Henry Hawker goes to work as a mechanic for Sopwith, and he learns how to fly. He kind of becomes a test pilot for them, and then he picks up a navigator and makes an attempt to be the first to achieve a nonstop flight across the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see this wonderful Newfoundland stamp with the overprint. And so they set off in this biplane, and about 14 and a half hours later, the engine overheats, which was a typical problem. There was a lot of back and forth during that era about whether or not engines should be air-cooled or water-cooled, and there were problems associated with both. So in this particular case, they go ahead and they find, they get over the shipping lanes, they find a Danish ship, and they kind of crash land in front of it, and they're saved. Which is a lot better than the fate of a lot of people that tried crossing the Atlantic in those days. Now, Alcott and Brown, here they are, they're military pilots, and they'd spent some time as POWs. And while they're sitting around cooling their heels, they're thinking, wouldn't it be cool if we took a Vimy and flew across the Atlantic? And they did it. And you can see that they landed in a bog. So it was kind of a graceless landing, but that was after a tremendous effort and getting all the way across the Atlantic, and that was pretty impressive. And this was 10 years before Lindbergh. And then we have A.C. Reed. He's in the U.S. Navy, and they're doing a lot of work trying to extend the range of military aviation. But you can see from this picture on the right that what they did was they set up picket ships. They set up ships every couple of 100 miles so that they'd be able to help with navigation. They'd be able to fuel them and do all kinds of things. This is obviously not what we're thinking about when we think about being able to take an airplane across the Atlantic. I mean, if you need 20 ships stationed across the Atlantic in order for you to get across, this is obviously something where it hasn't quite reached maturity yet. But what they did was they flew down through the Azores and then came up around Spain and finally end up in Europe. But it's not just airplanes that are developing the capacity to cross the Atlantic. The first to get across is the British airship R-34, and in the summer of 1919, it crosses from east to west, and then the next week it goes back across. And this particular cover here was carried on the west to east flight going back to London, and this was just sold last month with Kelleher, which is the auction house that I work with. So as you can see, there's a lot of British aviation here in the early part here, and R-34 was not the only impressive airship that the Brits had. There were the sister ships, the R-100 and R-101. The R-100 being fairly conventional as airships go, and 101 being kind of pushing the state of the art. And if people haven't read the book His Majesty's Airship about how these lighter than aircraft were going to tie the empire together, you really should. It's a tremendous book, and it told a lot about the aspirations of British aviation and taught me a lot about dirigibles. And anyhow, so R-100 is in Canada, and 101 you can see over here on the right. This is a cover that I have. It's got the Gisquet marks on the top. You can see where it says was going to go by Airship 101, but it didn't go. And there's that auxiliary mark on the bottom where it says insufficient paid for transmission by airmail. So my assumption is that it went by ship. So for 8 years after those first nonstop heavier than air crossings by the Vimy in 1919, no more flights like that. And then in 1927, we have 3 crossings. We have a crossing by Lindbergh, by Chamberlain, and also by Admiral Byrd. And they're all trying to win this Ortig Prize. So Ortig is a guy who owns a hotel. He's a wealthy American, and he puts up a prize of $25,000. And he says the first aviator from any allied country that's able to cross the Atlantic, either from Paris to New York or New York to Paris, I'm going to give you this prize. So you get all this wonderful competition going on. And the prize was not claimed for quite some time, but the kinds of people that were working on this were substantial. So Igor Sikorsky develops the S-35, and Rene Falk, who was a World War I ace, is the pilot of it, and it takes off, but it has problems because it's overweight. And, you know, being overweight is a common malady for these long distance airplanes because they have to carry so much fuel. And if you can get the plane off without crashing, you know, that ends up being one of the toughest parts, is just getting that much gas in the air. But in the Sikorsky case, he was overweight by about 2 tons, about 4,000 pounds. And part of the reason that they were so overweight is the pilot insisted that he wanted to bring a sofa with him and a refrigerator. So he did that, and the plane crashes, and that's the end of that. But to give you a sense, I mean, $25,000 is the equivalent of $422,000 in 2022 dollars. Well, the airplane that this guy wrecked because he wanted to bring a refrigerator and a sofa cost $80,000. It was far more than the prize money. So that was a substantial setback for Sikorsky. Some other aircraft that were working, the Belanca, a wonderful aircraft. And when Charles Lindbergh decided that he wanted to try for the prize, he went to go and buy this aircraft because he says, this is the plane that's going to be able to do it. So he negotiates with them. He says he's going to call this the WB2. He's going to call it the Spirit of St. Louis. Because he's got backers that are, you know, giving him money for this plane. But then Levine says to him, well, I'll sell you the airplane, but I want you to know when we do this flight for this prize, we get to pick the pilot and it's not going to be you. And Lindbergh's like, well, the whole point of this exercise was so that I could be the guy to do this. So he ends up not buying the plane. So Chamberlain ends up going, and he goes with Bert Balkin. And Balkin is a storied pilot. He ends up flying over the North Pole with Byrd, and he has a tremendous history with the U.S. Army Air Corps. He does rescue work in Alaska. I mean, he's just this larger than life guy. He was in the Olympics in 1912. So anyhow, Chamberlain and Balkin, they end up going across. They end up being the second across after Lindbergh. And so, you know, we've got the WB2, we've got the S-35, and then there's the Fokker. And Fokker, just a tremendous aircraft, and they create a variant called the C2. And instead of having one engine, it's got 3 engines. And this is the one that Byrd, who's got a lot of Fokker experience because he took a Fokker across the North Pole, says this is the plane that we're going to take across the Atlantic. So he goes with Balkin and Novell, and Bert Acosta is along as a navigator. And they could have gotten off before Lindbergh took off, but he didn't quite like the weather and he wanted to do some more testing and things like that. So obviously getting that $25,000 prize or being first across was important to him, but not the most important thing. And he ends up taking off after Lindbergh and getting across, but he ends up having problems too. So the first American to fly across and the one to win this Ortig prize is Charles Lindbergh. So he's a Airmail pilot, 24 years old. He tries to get somebody to buy him to sell him an airplane. He can't quite work that out. So he ends up having it custom built by a small aviation firm called Ryan out in California. And they build the plane to his specs, and he flies across the Atlantic. And about 20 years ago, I guess this is 2002, a 4th letter is found that he carried with him. Now, he was certainly approached to carry philatelic material. Rossler offered to give him $1,000 if he'd carry 1 inch thick stack of envelopes. And $1,000 was a lot of money. I mean, Lindbergh's entire savings, his life savings, was $2,000. So $1,000 is a lot of money for a pound of covers, but he declined because he didn't want to take any extra weight. But he took a couple of letters of introduction, and this item here on the left is a letter that he carried, and the letter on the bottom was sent by diplomatic pouch, and that's how the letter was returned. And it had an estimate in 2002 between $50,000 and $75,000. It sold for $85,000. And so here, this guy, he risks his life to get $25,000, and an envelope that he carries sells 20 years ago for $85,000. Now, here's a nice bird cover that I have. Bird did carry mail with him, and he gets over to Paris, and the weather's really poor. So he's trying to find the airfield, and he can't quite get it together. So they decide the safest thing to do would be to fly out to the coast and land on the beach. So he does that, and he lands. Everybody lives. It destroys the plane, and a lot of the mail got soaked. So the stamps would come off, and sometimes you'll buy these envelopes, and you look on the inside, and they've put a stamp in there so that you can glue it on if you want to have a stamp on your envelope. But it wasn't just like the Ortig Prize. There's this commercial pressure to be able to get across the Atlantic. So the manufacturer, the aircraft manufacturers, Junkers, had their W-33. They had two aircraft, the Europa and the Bremen, and they decided that they were going to try a transatlantic flight. And this was in August of 27. And in this particular case, it's autographed by the pilots. But they weren't able to do it. They had to come back. They had a second unsuccessful attempt in October. This is obviously, in this era, it's stretching the limits of what's possible in terms of what the engines can do, how much gas you can carry. We're not quite there in terms of being able to regularly move mail across the Atlantic. And there are other races. So they're the kind of the first transatlantic race, kind of a gimmicky thing. They decided they had these two aircraft, one they called the Yellow Bird and the other one called the Green Flash. And the Yellow Bird was going to fly from New York to Paris, and the Green Flash was going to fly to Rome. And so here on the bottom here, you can see a picture of these four gentlemen. The first three were scheduled to go on the plane. The fourth one was a stowaway. So they get in the plane, they take off, and they realize that they seem like they're overweight. And after a while, they kind of realize that there's this stowaway. He just thought it would be an adventure. He wanted to go. And so their first thought was to throw him out of the airplane. And some airplanes at this point were carrying parachutes, and had they had a parachute, they would have thrown him out. But they decided that they were talking about flying really low and just kicking him out, that sort of thing, over the water. But he ended up going, and they kind of warmed to him over time, and he ended up kind of like going on tour with them. So all's well that ends well. And this cover over here on the right was carried on the Yellow Bird from Maine. And but what ended up happening around this time, French government decides that these daredevils that are trying their hand to get across the Atlantic, that this is not a good idea. So between 1927 and 1929, there were 48 attempts to get across the Atlantic, and 50 people were killed. And a lot of these were amongst the finest aviators from the Great War. So the French government was trying to put a quash on it. And then there were some other flights. This was an interesting one, very successful, where these Hungarian pilots wanted to get some publicity, some attention for the dismemberment of Hungary after the Great War. And so they had this flight where they were going to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a very, very capable aircraft and fly from the United States to Budapest. And so that's what they did. And wonderful flight and wonderful documentation from that. And then in fascist Italy, we have General Balbo, who is in charge of the aviation in fascist Italy, decides he's going to do these kind of, it's not quite a world flight, but this this Italian air armada, and it's powerful. So they take off out of Rome, and they fly down the west coast of Africa, and they fly across to South America, and end up in Rio de Janeiro. And so this cover over here on the left has some wonderful stamps on it, and it's autographed by all the crews. They took 14 aircraft and did this, and you can see one of the aircraft down there in the lower right. Just a tremendously powerful achievement in aviation, but also it lent great credibility to the fascist regime. And he would do this each year. He would have this tremendous air armada trip, and I think we'll see a cover from the Century of Progress in 33 as well. Yeah. Okay, so up until 1933, Northern Atlantic aviation history, only 28 successful flights out of 78. But here he is, he's taking 25 aircraft. He goes up to Reykjavik in Iceland, and then comes across out into Canada, goes down to New York, then goes across to the Century of Progress in Chicago. And you can see this is a registered cover that was coming back out of New York. So just tremendously powerful from a PR perspective, and also a demonstration of aviation might. You can see on his return trip, he takes a more southerly route, and then ends up in going through Lisbon and then back up through into Rome. And some other interesting transatlantic things around this time, 1930, 31, 34. Here's a plane called Liberty that's flying from Liberty, New York to Copenhagen, and the Warsaw, which is going from New York City to Poland. And these were both successful. And then this was also an interesting time for women. So Amelia Earhart, who was kind of the female Lindbergh, right? There were a bunch of women who were trying to break out of traditional female roles. And one of the areas that women wanted to be recognized in was in aviation. So one of the contemporaries to Amelia is Ruth Nichols. And she decides that she wants to fly the Atlantic. So this is an envelope that she had prepared for a New York to Paris flight, and which never ended up happening. But she did all kinds of things. I mean, she was able to fly as a pilot a dirigible, a glider, and autogyro, seaplanes, biplanes, triplanes, transport aircraft, and including supersonic jets. So a tremendous career. She was one of the 99s, which was a group of female pilots that Amelia Earhart started. And they decided, they kind of queried all of the women in aviation and asked them to join into this supportive group. And it turns out that the number of people in the founding group were 99 pilots. And as we try to move mail along faster, it's clear that doing it by air moves things faster than moving it by ship. But because our aircraft are not able to, they don't have the long enough legs to get across the Atlantic on their own, you could have this combination of having a ship and also an airplane. So if you had an airplane that you could launch from a ship off of a catapult, and you send it from the ship to the shore before the ship docks, you could get there faster. So if it takes several days in order for a ship to get across the ocean, but you could take an airplane when it starts to get close enough so that you take a day and a half off, that's worth paying for. And it doesn't sound like it. If you were sending a letter to someone in your family, maybe taking another day and having something less expensive is fine. But imagine for commerce, imagine if you were a bank and you were trying to clear checks. So you take a bunch of checks and you put it on a ship and you get close enough and it takes off by airplane and it gets there a day or two quicker. Well, you have your money a day or two quicker. So there is pressure, there's commercial pressure for us to move the mail faster. And one of the ways to do that is catapult mail, ship to shore. And it was just this, it was a very brief period of time. It was from like late, like 1928 to 1934 or so. And at some point, airplanes have long enough legs and you don't really need to be doing this because this is kind of tough stuff, right? Because you have to land near the ship and then it's got to have a crane to pick you up. And it's a difficult thing. But for a couple of years there, catapult mail was an interesting thing. And that's one of the 47 things that we collect in the American Airmail Society. And then in addition to heavier than air airplanes, we also have the introduction of the Zeppelins. So ZR3, which was built by the Zeppelin Company as reparations from the Great War for the Americans, here flies over in October of 1924, and you can see in this Rossler cache, it's showing the Zeppelin and the Statue of Liberty as it's coming into New York. And the Zeppelins flew all over the place. I mean, over here on the right with these wonderful airmail stamps is showing part of the South American flights where it's going to Rio de Janeiro in the early 1930s. And it flew all over the place. And this is the Graf Zeppelin. So this is a wonderful cover in the upper left-hand corner. It's a registered cover out of Casablanca, and it's got all these wonderful overprints. And it's headed to Brazil. So, I mean, isn't this delightful? The one in the middle, this is flying across the Pacific because it's on the round-the-world flight of the Graf Zeppelin going from Tokyo to the United States. And then the one in the lower right is nice because it's got mixed ranking, right? It's got the four Reichsmark Zeppelin stamp from Germany, and it's got American definitives on it. And that one's flying around the world out of New York. And so in addition to the Graf Zeppelin, which flew 1 million miles and never had any problems, they built a larger ship, the Hindenburg, which was very successful in 1936 and 1937, but ended up becoming the kind of the final chapter of airships in terms of passengers and taking mail and things like that, because it had a spectacular accident, and that was in May of 1937. And so I show these covers principally because last month when I was bidding on some crash mail in the Kelleher auction, I didn't have enough money. There were some very deep-pocketed people in Germany that decided that they wanted those crash covers. So this is kind of the closest thing that I have. These are ones that were supposed to be on the Hindenburg that week. So here you see some leaving out of Rhine-Main, and the one in the middle, that one was on the Hindenburg. It's called onboard mail. You can see it says Hindenburg on it. That was person bought the postcard, bought the stamps, and it was canceled while the thing is in flight. And then one on the bottom was mail that was supposed to be going to France from a business in New York, but they returned it back to sender because of the accident. So with the Hindenburg, it was carrying 17,000 pieces of mail, which was not uncommon. And when it came, it had a terrible fire and it crashed. And whether that was static electricity or struck by lightning or somebody planted a bomb, it's never really been ascertained exactly what was going on. There is smoking on board the ship, and it is filled full of hydrogen. So, I mean, there were a couple of different kinds of things that might have happened. But this was kind of the end of the airship era, and the Zeppelins were really a bridge. I mean, they could fly all over the world, but in terms of moving airmail, they were a bridge kind of waiting for planes to be more capable and have longer legs and be able to fly across the Atlantic without any assistance. And so by this time, by 1937, we're kind of at the point where planes can fly the Atlantic. And here you can see, this is a wonderful cover that you can see it's autographed by the pilot up at the top. And it has all kinds of mixed franking on it. It's got US postage. It's got some stuff out of Hong Kong. It's got a British revenue stamp on it. And it's also got Portuguese stamps. So this is one, it went two different ways. You can see all of the wonderful postmarks on the back, but it went between New York and the Azores. And so having a place that was kind of, it's not equidistant, but somewhere in the middle that you can refuel before you go on to Lisbon and to the continent was really very useful. And then we start getting these first trans-Atlantic airmail ones where like Air France would go from Marseille and go to Lisbon and then go to the Azores and then to New York and get all these wonderful frankings. And obviously they are, they're overfranked. It's done for collectors. And in the upper left-hand corner, someone has taken an envelope from Imperial Airways, put some British stamps on it, and then someone negated the British stamps. They drew through them. So there's some philatelic stuff going on here, not just postal administration things. And a wonderful opportunity to promote your business. So here's one to a chief engineer at the General Radio Company saying, hey, this envelope is coming to you on the Yankee Clipper, and I hope you enjoy it. And it makes for a nice keepsake. And then in terms of getting across the Pacific, now there's an even bigger challenge, right? We thought the Atlantic was tough. But in 1931, Allen and Moyle are attempting a nonstop flight. They're going from Japan to Seattle. But, it turns out that it's not just difficult to get an engine to not overheat, or to carry enough gas, but you really need to know what's going on with the winds aloft. And are there big storms happening? And like when we get to the cover showing the Voyager that flew around the world, the thing that was the game changer for them was not really the airplane. It was the fact that they had satellite weather and they were able to find out how to get around the storms and how to get a tailwind. And, in 1931, these guys didn't have that. So they're trying to get from Japan to Seattle, but storms forced the plane down in some remote island in the Pacific. They eventually end up in Alaska, and then they get to Tacoma. So they eventually kind of, make their way back. But they're on an uninhabited island for 7 days without food or shelter. And then the Siberian coast and Seattle. Wow. And the U.S. Navy is always trying to increase their capabilities. So one of the things that they're doing is they're flying out of the West Coast and making flights out to Hawaii. So these are some of the early flights where they do these mass flights, training flights, which are as much about navigation as they are anything else. And then there are races. Right. So this is a race that goes between London and Australia, and it had some wonderful participants in it. Roscoe Turner, who liked to fly with a lion named Gilmore with him, very colorful character. The Heinmuller envelope, the one on the lower right, he was a past president of the American Airmail Society, and he was a timekeeper for Longines, for the watch company that did all of they certified the records. And so he had a tremendous collection. And then some of the mail, this Trans-Pacific mail is just delightful. The one in the lower right, this is Amon Carter. He owned a big newspaper in Houston. So he's a very, very successful, wealthy businessman and a big stamp collector. So he would have all kinds of wonderful things done, and you can tell it's obviously over frank, right? But it's also fun to look at. And then these are called survey flights. So in the Pacific, Pan Am, which was kind of stretching their legs to get across the Pacific, did a bunch of island hopping, and they brought some covers with them. Some of them before the post office really wanted you to be carrying mail, but they would carry things as souvenirs. And you can see some of these are autographed by the crew. And in addition to people like Edmund Music, also Fred Noonan is here. And Noonan was a navigator and did a tremendous job getting them across the Pacific. But tragically, he was lost 2 years later when he was accompanying Amelia Earhart when she was trying to get across the Pacific. Here are some early, I think the cachets are probably done with linoleum. So they're pretty crude, but these were done by Jesse Johnson, who ended up becoming an admiral and a future president of the American Airmail Society. And I love these. I call them primitives because I think they're probably done in wood block, and that's how they did these cachets. And these were, like I say, they were carried not as official mail, but as souvenirs, as documentation that these guys had made these flights to Midway and to Wake and to Canton Island, and during this time. The aircraft were becoming far more capable with the Martin M130 and the Boeing 314, some tremendous aircraft and some tremendous navigation. And I show this one. This is kind of poignant. This cachet was supposed to be applied to the mail that Amelia Earhart was carrying on her round the world flight. And this was on the Itasca, which was stationed at Howland Island, which she was trying to find on her way back to California. And she missed the island, and she's out in the middle of the Pacific, and they run out of gas, and they're never seen again. But this is the cachet that they would have used, and it's autographed on the back by all the radio operators that were out at Howland Island trying to find her. And just some early covers from San Francisco and Guam, and it's beautiful, and I love the back stamps, Macau and Canton and all kinds of wonderful places. And then like New Guinea, how fun is that? It's a registered cover that has a complete set with the overprints. And then we're at the point where they can do all kinds of fanciful things with their philatelic mail. So here they're sending something to Auckland, and then they say, okay, well now let's send it to West Africa, to South Africa, trans Tasman, okay, by surface mail. So obviously, some of this stuff is fairly philatelically contrived, but it's fun anyhow. And then to see nations that start to develop their own aircraft industry. So, for example, with China, I mean, such a large country, to be able to tie it together and bring it closer is exciting to watch. And they were excited about it too. And in the creation of the China National Aviation Corporation, they had some wonderful envelopes, and you can see where they're going all the way through China and going across, connecting out to London, and this particular one going through Hanoi and ending up in the States. And here's one on the Hong Kong Clipper, autographed by some of the crew, and with some wonderful franking from Hong Kong. And a complete set of some of the early airmails. And I love the way they've done the cachet along the bottom here. You've got a business-sized envelope. You've got plenty of room across the bottom, and what you can do is show you how big the Pacific really is, right? Going from Shanghai and Manila all the way out to Guam and Wake and Midway and Hawaii, and then finally getting to San Francisco. And they got to all of the little islands in the Pacific, to Canton, Canton. And I put this FAM 22 cover in the lower right because you look at this and it says Miami, December 6th, 1941. And after that, a day or two later, everything changes. Everything closes down and gets rerouted. And we have to figure out new ways of communicating in the world because we were used to sending things by mail, by airplane, and getting them there pretty quick. And now those are shut down because we're a world at war again. And that's a whole different kind of story. And then I love round the world covers. I just think that's just so delightful. And one of the ones that I definitely want to get is one of these round the world flight that is mixed franking with the British and American stamps on it. It's just a wonderful cover, and you can see all the places they went. They started in April of 24, and 5 months later, 5.5 months later, they've made it all the way back around, and they've gone to all these wonderful places. And the closest I've gotten so far is this postcard that is canceled in Seattle and in Boston. But I really want to get one of these round the world covers. I think that would be really neat. There were a number of people that did these kind of round the world things, like John Mears. And here he is doing it in 28 and then again in 1930. And then Wiley Post, what a storied career. And he took Harold Gatty as his navigator, and they flew the Winnie Mae. The story of the Winnie Mae is Post was kind of he was a rough guy. He was a worker in the oil fields. Spent some time in jail for armed robbery, and he's out in the oil fields, and there's an accident. And he gets hit in the eye and it gets infected, and they have to take the eye out. So he ends up getting this patch. Well, the settlement from the lawsuit for having his injury, he took that money and he bought an airplane. And you don't really think of somebody who's a one-eyed person being a round the world famous pilot, but that's who he was. And he did all these wonderful things. He figured out that if you flew high enough, that there was a steady stream of air that you could use as a tailwind that went from west to east. And they call it the jet stream. But you'd have to be at like 20,000 feet. So, there isn't enough sensible air, oxygen at that altitude. It's too spread out that you can't really breathe at 20,000 feet. You need to have supplemental oxygen. So he works with the B.F. Goodrich Company, and they build a suit, and he has like this diving bell helmet that he puts on, and it allows him, it's kind of a pressure suit. It's the first pressure suit, and it allows him to fly in the jet stream, where it could be 200 miles an hour behind you, and if you're going west to east and you're in the jet stream, you're moving. And so when he was a pilot, he was working for one of the guys who owned some of the oil rigs. The guy who owned the oil rigs, his daughter's name was Winnie Mae, and he has this wonderful plane, and Wiley Post is his personal pilot, and so he asks to borrow this airplane, and he flies around the world, and these are some of the cancels in Long Island, in Germany, and also in Russia. Some of the other ones, Mattern and Griffin. This is one of only 12 covers that they took around the world. This one's fun. Van Dusen was a rep for I think for Pan Am, and they got all kinds of postage on this, makes for a fun cover. And this was Howard Hughes. So Howard Hughes was a test pilot, and he decides he's going to fly around the world. And this is right before the World's Fair in 1939. And so he does this, and he's got, I don't know, maybe 200 of these that he gives out to friends. These were never sold, but they were carried on his round the world flight. And if you look carefully, you can see that the Russian stamp has been canceled, but it's not tied to the envelope. And in no cases is this envelope have a Russian stamp canceled on it. So I guess it kind of at the end of the trip or something, they thought, well, you know, it could use another stamp. Let's put a Russian stamp on them. So they all have Russian stamps, but none of them were applied to the envelope at the time. And then after that, Milton Reynolds, he's an interesting character. He made his money with ballpoint pens. So during World War II, he sells ballpoint pens, makes a fortune, and then he buys a war surplus plane made by Douglas, an A-26, and he's got his pilot and his flight engineer, and they fly around the world, and they get there faster than Howard Hughes. And the military is doing this too, right? They're stretching their legs and they're showing that they're able to be capable. So a Boeing B-50 flies, it says first nonstop flight around the world. And I'm thinking to myself, that's really the first nonstop flight around the world? Well, it was, but they did air refueling. So yeah, so they had all the gas they wanted. So yeah, so that's great. And here's the first woman to fly solo around the world, Jerry Mock. She worked at a small airport and learned how to fly and just kind of decided one day she was going to do it. And she did. And then Sheila Scott flies over the North Pole, and she's doing this in a light plane, right? You know, this is a little Piper Aztec. So it's pretty tremendous. And obviously at this point, navigation and the kind of support that you need to make these things happen is pretty substantial. Here's another woman, Brooke Knapp, and she's flying the American Dream 2, which is a business jet, and she flies over both the poles. So that was pretty impressive. But this has got to be my favorite. So Burt Rutan is probably the greatest aircraft designer of the 20th century. And he designs a whole bunch of planes. He designed Spaceship One, which was the first plane first rocket ship to fly in outer space, come back and be sent up again 2 weeks later. He's designed all these home builts, the Very Easies and all this sort of stuff. And he gets his brother, Dick Rutan, to pilot a plane that flies around the world on one tank of gas. So it's basically going to just be this big tank of gas with some wings on it. It's going to make this big sailplane. So Dick Rutan takes his girlfriend, whose name is Gina Yeager, who's not related to Charles Yeager. It's just a different person. And they do it. They fly around the world, and they were principally able to do it because they had incredible support in terms of what the weather was going to be like. You know, where could they go? Because obviously, you imagine you could fly through a storm and something like this would rip this airplane apart. And Dick Rutan, who was an incredibly brave fighter pilot in Vietnam, he was called a Misty FAC, a forward air controller. So he would fly in an F-4 and try to get the North Vietnamese to shoot at him so that he could identify where their batteries were, and then they would, fighter bombers would come in and destroy it. So this guy was incredibly brave, and he did multiple tours in Vietnam and been shot down. And I mean, there was no question about this guy's bravery. He said when he got out of Voyager, when they got around the world, and he got out, and he said, I will never get into that again. He was terrified of this airplane. Its characteristics of trying to turn around and bite you, or crash or break apart, or he said it was so close to the limits of what was possible that he was scared every moment he was in the plane. Well, Burt Rutan designs for Steve Fawcett an airplane. So here Steve is going to fly nonstop around the world on one tank of gas, solo. And he does that. He flies from Kansas to Kansas and does it in this aircraft. And Fawcett had all kinds of records. And one of the things that he decided he wanted to do was he went with another pilot, and they recreated the flight of Alcott and Brown in a Vimy, a replica Vimy, in 2005 as a tribute to the Brits who were able to make it happen in 1919. And lastly, when we think about mail going around the world, this was sent up in 1983 on the Space Shuttle Challenger. And so this envelope went around the world every 90 minutes. And, you know, when we think about Lindbergh getting across in 33 hours across the Atlantic, or someone making it across the Pacific, or, you know, how long does it take to fly around the world? I mean, if it was Howard Hughes, it was about a week and a half. And here it is every hour and a half circling the globe. And you could buy these in the post office in the United States for $15 when they came out in 1983. And so that was, you know, talk about coming full circle. That was aviation and airmail. Okay.